Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Adam. You're watching Weekend Watch Repair. Thank you so much for stopping by. Although it may be a little late to say Happy New Year at this point, this is my first video of 2025, so Happy New Year. I hope you're doing well. Today on the bench, we have got this beautiful 1963 Omega Seamaster with a caliber 5.52. This watch is owned by a subscriber of the channel, and with the power of the internet, it's just incredible. This came to me all the way from Queensland, Australia, and I am here in the central United States, and it's just incredible what technology can do and bringing people together. And I'm really pleased to bring this to you today. I'm doing some initial function testing, just getting a feel for this watch, and what I noticed initially is that although everything is does appear to be working, the winding on this watch is very difficult. Very, very difficult. Much more difficult than it really should be. This watch arrived with a deployant clasp. A deployant clasp is a pretty nifty way of securing a strap in such a way that you never lose your position. It creates an unbroken link on the strap where you can remove it and put it back on without having to readjust the strap. It's not original to the watch, and we're not going to be reusing it, but so it'll go back to the owner when we're done with this watch. Strap removal is made easy by the use of quick release spring bars. You may catch the reflection in the case back, but I'm wearing my Seiko Pogue t-shirt that I got from Mike at My Retro Watches. He created a website where he's got some really cool watch related shirts. So great website, Mike. Sorry, a little shameless plug there for him. We put the watch on the time grapher, and the owner said that this watch was keeping pretty decent time when he sent it to me, but he thought it was due for service. Putting it on the time grapher, the initial results are quite surprising. Our amplitude's a hair low, but wow, we turned it over and our signal got kind of bad. I turned up the gain on the time grapher, but that didn't seem to do anything. And yeah, changing positions again, we have some pretty big positional difference. Amplitude dropped more in the vertical positions, which is expected, but it's definitely due. It's obviously running best in dial up, but overall, it's definitely in need of a service. The case back was loosened on the press off camera. Once we got it loosened, now we can just use our little 8-ball and remove the case back. And you can definitely tell an Omega movement from a long ways away. That signature color of plating that they use is really pretty. Beginning disassembly, we need to first remove the automatic rotor. In order to do that, this little piece that we're removing is called the gib, and that secures the rotor in place. These can be a little bit stubborn to get out sometimes, and worst case scenario, you just need to lift up on the automatic rotor a little bit to give yourself a little clearance to get that gib out, but we got it out without too much fuss. Once that's removed, the rotor can be lifted straight up. And I noticed there as I did that the movement kind of wiggled around inside the case a little bit. And possible we have a case clamp that's not really securing it properly, so I'll have to look into that. Depressing the plunger on the setting lever allows us to remove our crown and stem. And aside from the rust that's on the stem, we do have an issue. I don't know if you see it there, but we'll get into that here in a bit. Now we can remove these case clamps. These case clamps attach to the movement and put pressure on the underside of a lip that's machined into the case to hold the movement in place. The tightness of those case clamps is determined by, you'll notice those little clamps have an elevation change in them, and the degree of that change affects how tightly it grabs onto the case. So we may need to adjust one of those later. But with those out of the way, we can now separate the movement from the case. Next step is to remove the hands. And in order to do that, we need to reinstall our stem. We'll go ahead and press the plunger back in and put our stem back in. And now we can adjust the hands to a position where they're lined up to allow removal of the hands. Plastic protects the dial and the hands during removal. And I'm being very, very gentle with these hand levers. But I'm also noticing that hour hand is extremely tight on that hour wheel. So just being very careful, but they've got to come off. So we'll go ahead and lift those off. It is a very tight squeeze on there, though. And now we'll just let gravity do its job and pop these hands into this little holder. And there's a insert that'll go into that holder that we'll put the dial in here in a minute. In order to remove the dial, there are two dial feet screws that secure the dial to the movement. We got one loosened, and flipping the watch over, I noticed that, well, we're missing the other screw on the other side. So we'll need to source one of those screws. With the one screw at least loosened, with a little bit of persuasion, we can very gently lift the dial from the movement. I like to begin disassembly on the back side of the movement, but in order to do that, we must first remove the hour wheel and the cannon pinion. With the cannon pinion removed, that will allow us to remove our center wheel from the other side. Beginning disassembly on the back side of the movement, we must first remove the automatic bridge. We are unable to unwind the watch with this in place. So getting this removed, we have two screws to come out. And then have to gently raise this bridge up. And right now there is tension between the ratchet wheel and the driving wheel on that automatic bridge. So we just gently lever this up. There we go. Now we can safely remove it. Omega uses a very interesting reversing wheel system on these, although they don't call it a reversing wheel, they call it a winding gear, but it is a reversing wheel. We'll get into that here in a bit. On this ratchet wheel, you see that little screw there. What that is connected to a little gear on the underside of the ratchet wheel, because this is basically a two-piece ratchet wheel system. So turning it one way, you see that screw doesn't rotate and it's engaging the ratchet wheel on the underside of that and turning the watch. When you turn the crown backwards, it basically allows it to slip so it doesn't wind, turn the ratchet wheel in the opposite direction, thus maybe unwinding the mainspring or uncoiling it, the barrel arbor from the mainspring. A really clever yet very effective way of doing it. But holding the click back allows us to release power from the mainspring by releasing the crown between our fingers. Now we can remove our balance. One screw secures the balance cock in place. And there's a little relief cut on the underside of the balance bridge that allows us to get a screwdriver in there. We just gently lift that up to kind of break the tension on that. And now we can gently and safely remove the balance. Very delicate part. Next up, there's two screws holding this pallet fork bridge in place. You can see the way the light reflects on that screw. These screws have a black polish on them, which is pretty impressive to do. And we've covered it in previous videos, but what black polish is that the surface level of the item polished is extremely flat and extremely even, to a degree that when light reflects off of it, all the light was reflected off in the same direction. So if the light is not reflecting right back at you, it appears black. And when it does reflect at you, the entire part is illuminated. It's quite a difficult thing to achieve, actually, to get black polish, but a lot of parts on this watch is black polish. That pallet fork had a good black polish on it. It's not an easy standard to meet, so it's quite impressive that they do it, even on screws that you never see and all that. But Omega made some really, really good quality movements. The train bridge is next. Removing those two screws on the bridge allows us to do the same thing. We're going to go ahead and use those relief cuts on the underside of the bridge to very gently lever this bridge up, being very careful not to damage any pivots. Once we do, we can safely lift this bridge away. And taking a look at this train bridge, I can already tell it's going to be a nightmare reinstalling these wheels. All those lower pivots are very tall, and so basically all these wheels have to stand up very tall and kind of balance against one another to get lined up. So reassembly will be not the easiest one I've ever done. But there's our train. Next up, this watch has a sweep seconds pinion. That is the post that the seconds hand mounts to. There is a tension spring that we're removing right now for that sweep seconds pinion. And what that allows is it smooths out the movement and makes the seconds hand not appear jumpy and all that. And it's a tension spring that puts very, very light downward pressure. But that pinion is removed, and that is a very tiny, extremely delicate part. Moving on, we can disassemble our crown wheel. This has an off-center screw, so that's not reverse threaded, but now we can pull out our crown wheel. And if we flip it over, we can separate the crown wheel from the crown wheel core right there. That has a very pretty sunburst graining pattern on it. Now we can, if I can get my tweezers to work, we can get rid of the core. And that little washer there is, I didn't notice that right away, but I'll catch that during inspection later on, and we'll remove that little washer, or it's not really a bushing, but more of a washer for the crown wheel. But moving on to the ratchet wheel, this top piece is actually what they call a ratchet wheel. And as we flip that over, you'll see that little gear in there. And this bottom piece, I believe, if I remember correctly, they call it an automatic ratchet wheel mounted, which sounds like an incomplete statement, but that's what they call it. We got a little bit of play there in the barrel arbor bushing. By far, not the worst we've ever seen, but there's a little bit of play in there. Next step, to disassemble the click on these style movements, it's made really easy to you can release tension on the spring like that before unscrewing and removing the click, and that allows you to not really have any fear of having that spring fly off, because that's a $20 to $25 mistake if I lose that. But as I struggle here for a moment to remove this click, it doesn't really want to budge. But eventually we'll get it out of there. But one or two of those have flied off in my career, and so if there's a simple way of releasing tension on the click spring before uh, disassembling the click, I always find it better to do so. But this movement makes it really easy to do. So once the click's out of the way, we can remove that spring. Now we can remove our barrel bridge. This is held on by 3 screws. Off camera, I like to line up the screws generally and just see if one of the screws is different from the others, if they're particular to a position. On this barrel bridge, they are not. They're all the same, so there's no fear of that, and we don't have to worry about reinserting them in any particular order. So we're good to go on this barrel bridge. And that's looking really good. We don't show any barrel rub or anything on the underside of that bridge, so that's great. Now our center wheel can come out, and that is the wheel that the cannon pinion we pulled out earlier attaches to. And our barrel can come out. And outside of some gunk on the underside of that barrel, it looks to be in pretty good visual shape. We have the watch flip back over, and we can get the rest of the keyless work and motion work disassembled. So first, we just loosen the screws for the setting lever spring, and now we can release tension on that spring and fully remove these screws. There's some evidence of some old grease and whatnot on that part. Our minute wheel can come off, and our setting gear. And I'm taking a look at the teeth on that setting gear to see if one side of those teeth have a curved radius cut to the end of it, and it does. So we'll make sure during reassembly that that curved side of the teeth goes towards that setting gear. Next up is the yoke spring. There's a few ways of removing these. I'm more of a fan of just shoving Rodico down in there and smothering it, and then manipulating the spring till we get it out. And as long as I do my part and don't release the Rodico, there's not much chance of it flying away. Although, and on camera on previous videos, I have failed in my duty and had a spring go flying. Our yoke can come out. And this here is the setting lever tension spring. That is a spring that applies constant downward tension on that setting lever. So if you depress the plunger from the other side to remove your stem, that is the spring that pushes everything back in place. Next up, our setting lever can come out. Pull our crown and stem out again. And lastly, we can just push the sliding clutch and winding pinion out. We can go ahead and remove those parts as well. Moving on, we can disassemble the automatic works. There are 3 screws holding the small bridge in place. One of these screws is different from the other 2, and we'll show that here in a moment. That one I'm unscrewing right now is different from the others. It's slightly longer. As I pull these screws off, I'm going to line them up so you can see it. I'm going to place an arrow. On that one big wheel you see, that arrow is pointing to a little brass plate that acts as the pivot point for that wheel. And right there, you can see the difference on that one screw compared to the 2 others. The reason I put that arrow there is to show, as we disassemble this automatic work further, on the underside of that driving wheel where it is next to the base plate of the assembly, if that brass bushing is worn or brass pivot point is worn, you'll see a lot of marking and scoring where that driving wheel will rub that base plate of the automatic work. There's our reversing wheel, and that's kind of got a planetary gear system in there. A really interesting way of doing that. We can remove that driving wheel. And right here where this arrow comes up, that's where the scoring would be if that plate we referenced earlier was worn out, but we're good. And that reversing wheel can actually be disassembled if you have a proper tool and a base. There's a way of servicing these without doing it, and that's what we're going to do here. Moving on, we can disassemble our barrel. So we got the barrel lid separated, and we'll go ahead and pull that away. Quite pleasant to see as we open that up. It's not completely smothered in grease, which is always nice to see. We'll separate our barrel arbor and go ahead and lift that out of the way. But at first glance, that spring looks to be in pretty good shape, although the plan is to install a brand new mainspring in this as part of the service for this watch's owner. Removing the mainspring, I like to just pull out the inner coil a little bit, using my thumbs to keep everything from unwinding, and a couple extra coils usually come out in the process when I do it that way. But I just kind of keep it all held together, get those loose coils out of the way, and then just unwind it from the mainspring. And now we have our mainspring removed. We've reattached the balance to the main plate, and now we can open up this shock spring, being very careful as we hinge that up. Now I can use this little sticky tool and remove the jewel. And that's 2 pieces. There's a capstone and a chaton of the setting that it's in. And being very careful as we lever the spring back down, that little hinge that it's in it's very easy to kink those and get them twisted. And if you use any force, it can bend that spring. So the shock spring on the back side of the watch is screwed into place. We've already done that, and we remove that setting. This is the tension spring for the sweep seconds pinion. And you see right there, see that little dimple right at the end. This is a very common wear point on those. That actually should be flat without a dimple, but we're going to install a new one. And now I just wanted to show just a short little montage, if you want to call it that, of cleaning some pivots with a silicone cleaning pad. E-Flex is the brand name. This is a generic, but it's a silicone polishing pad, very fine grit. And all this does is just kind of clean up the pivots a little bit. I'm using tweezers to hold the wheel in place, and it may look like I'm using a lot of pressure, but it's just barely enough pressure to keep that wheel in place. This E-Flex is just, it's not, it's not a jacket tool. It's not moving material. It's just kind of cleaning up any scoring marks or anything, and just allowing us just to really see the condition of these pivots and all that and clean them up so we can do a close inspection. So we have all the wheel train parts here. Taking a look at the pivots, really, nothing else has been cleaned on them just yet. But this is a check I like to do, to take a look at the pivots and really know if any of these wheels need to be put on a jacket lathe or replaced. But I'm pretty happy with the condition of them. I think they all look pretty good. Pretty incredible to see how they machine such a tiny part. There's our pallet fork. And we'll double check the jewel faces on the pallet fork as well, just to make sure there's no chips or cracks or anything. And those are looking all right. Moving on to pre-cleaning, we'll show the main plate here, but what we're doing is using some sharpened pegwood, going through and cleaning all the jewels out, and then trying to break up any loose grease and grime and get that cleaned away. And the main purpose of this is we'll get better results out of the cleaning machine once we do this. And those cleaning fluids for the machine are prohibitively expensive to swap out very often. They're very expensive. They got, chemicals in them and brighteners and other agents. And if you can get this base gunk off of there, you'll get more life out of your cleaning fluid and a better end result. So once all that's done and we wash those parts in naphtha, we can go ahead and load them into our cleaning baskets. We'll begin with putting some of the more delicate parts like the escape wheel and the sweep seconds pinion and other parts of the gear train in those little baskets to protect them. And then we can load up the rest of the parts. You may notice that little crown wheel washer. I did catch that, and that was in the stack of parts that we're loading. No mainspring since we're going to install a new one. But with that done, we can move this over to the cleaning machine. And I need to get some new footage for this cleaning montage. But our cleaning machine has one wash cycle, 3 rinse cycles, and a drying cycle. And as always, a really big heartfelt thank you. And I mean this from the bottom of my heart. This channel doesn't work without the support of the patron members. And I really, really do appreciate your support. And I owe some shout outs to some people at the end of this video. I didn't want you to think I forgot you like I did in the last one. So shout outs are coming. Moving on, this crown, the issue we have with this crown outside of the rust is that the crown tube separated from the watch case when this was pulled out. Right there, it should be attached to the case right there and not inside the crown. So we're going to have to try to repair this crown tube. But first we need to remove it. So I'm using some double-aught tweezers, some size 00 tweezers, which are very thick and chunky. Allow me to get a grab on that thing and pull it out. But we'll see if we can repair that part. Now we can remove the crystal. And this is what they call an armored crystal, meaning there's a tension ring around the inside of the crystal that keeps tension on it while it's held in. So we'll get that popped out, and then there's a little issue with this crystal. What the issue is that the tension ring is actually inverted. You see that beveled edge? Right now, that would be facing towards the inside of the watch. That needs to be facing the wearer of the watch. And that creates like a gold trim that goes between the crystal and the edge of the dial. So one side of this has that beveled cut on it, which should be facing outward. And the other side of that is actually flat, and that should be facing inward. So I actually put a post up on the Instagram and on Patreon to see if can you spot the error, and one person actually saw it. And not the easiest thing to see, but he caught it, and so we sent him a little gift package, although Postal Service is still trying to find it, but eventually it'll get there, or we'll send him another one. But if we reinsert this in the correct way, you can see the flat side of that tension ring is facing backwards. And so if you're wearing the watch, now you can see that gold trim around the edge. And that creates a kind of a visual dynamic for the wearer while also acting as a tension ring for the crystal. So although we're going to put a new crystal in this watch, I just thought it'd be interesting to show you that. Moving onwards, this case back gasket is very dried up and very, very much stuck inside the lip of this case. So this is a very effective way of ruining the tips on brass tweezers, but I don't want to create a bunch of scratches and marks, so we sacrifice the tips on my tweezers, and I'll have to redress those later. But we put our case and our case back in a small little container with items like our crown and stem and whatnot, and little small pieces in here. We'll put these in the ultrasonic. Now we can see what kind of music this thing wants to play for us today. Okay, moving on to trying to repair the crown tube. We want to expand this crown tube out a little bit to press it back into the case and create some friction. So we put it on a conical stump and a flat top base, and we're just going to use some extremely light taps to try to expand this out. Very light taps, and that's basically it. It doesn't take much to move that material, so we'll go ahead and set that aside and give it a test fit. So I did it off camera, but I just took a very soft cotton mop and some Dialux and gently went over this case to kind of shine it up, which I think it came out quite nicely. And we're putting some permanent sealant in here. And technically, this is kind of an overkill step because if this thing is pressed in, it should have plenty of tension being pressed in to never really come out on its own. But that sealant just acts as an insurance policy. So getting that thing started, it's going to be a tight squeeze, which is good. And we'll move it over to this little tool here. This tool, its only purpose is to press in and push out crown tubes. It's got these hard plastic tips that are firm enough to press it in, but won't scratch anything. But that presses in. It takes a decent amount of force, which is good. And now we can take a look and see that thing. It'll just pressed in perfect, like it should. It'll take about 24 hours for that adhesive to set. And once it is, that thing isn't going to go anywhere. It shouldn't go anywhere right now, but test fit the crown again. And although we are going to replace that with a new stem and replacement Omega crown, which you'll see later during assembly, all that looked good. Moving on to the balance jewels, this is the capstone. And so we first put it in one dip just to kind of get the main round of gunk off of it. And it comes out in one dip. I'm just using some sharpened pegwood and just getting any of the last remaining bits off, and then using some Rodico, kind of scrubbing it in a horizontal motion, and then rotating the jewel around. And as we rotate it around, we'll eventually cover all the surface area of the jewel. And then it'll go into one more round of one dip to remove just any leftover stuff left on by the Rodico. And then the chatons will get the same treatment. So using pegwood to scrub that, and then using Rodico to remove the remnants of the pegwood. It's a kind of a tedious process, but I find that the slower I go, the better results I'll get. And inside on the back side of that jewel, you can find a lot of gunk in there. So I'll just make sure all that gets cleaned out. And then I'll go back into one dip one more time as well. After the one dip, now we can lubricate. We're putting some Mobius 9010 on these jewels using the finest oiler that I have. And it's crazy the amount we're zoomed in and on this, but we get a nice little amount of oil right there, dead center. We'll put the chaton back into place. And now we can flip this over and see what that oil ring looks like. And yes, that's exactly what I'm looking for. About 50% coverage of that oil right dead center. So this, moving over the other side for the jewel for the main plate on the balance, that tiniest oiler takes about 2 trips to get the amount of oil that I'm looking for on there. And my next size up oiler usually puts too much, so I really like using that small one. put these two pieces together. Now we can flip this one over and just double check it as well, making sure that oil ring is right in the middle where we want it, and that's looking great. Now you can watch me fumble around a little bit if memory serves. I kind of fat finger these jewels a little bit, but eventually I'll get it in where it belongs. There we go. And again, being very careful bringing that spring down, because if you force it any, it's easy to kink those and then bend the spring, and that's the last thing that we want to do. And just doing a little cleanup. On the back side of the movement, I've got that setting back into place that you saw us remove earlier, and now you can see the footage that I didn't show during disassembly. And I'll eventually get that jewel where it belongs. And now our tension spring, and that is directional. There's an upside and a downside because there's a bend in that tension spring that when it gets screwed down, it puts downward pressure on that. So we'll get our screw into place, and that is a very tiny screw, but we're very much zoomed in. But now zoomed out a little bit, you can definitely see how small that screw is. Once again, just a little getting rid of any smudges or anything. And now I'm eyeballing the hairspring because I did disassemble this balance completely, clean the pivots on it as well. And I reset the post height and everything, and I'm checking flatness of the hairspring just to make sure, and it's looking just beautiful. And we'll give it a little spin test. What I like to do is to see if this balance will, spin freely on its own for an easy 30 to 45 seconds, which is what we're looking for. And it's all looking good. Moving on to the barrel. And so I haven't really got into it in the video yet, but this watch, it's not just a simple service as it turns out. And so one of the lessons I learned was about being a bit more thorough during inspections and all that, because a lot of times I'm concerned about the camera angles and whatnot. And, this watch gave me a reminder because there's some issues with this barrel that, I probably could have caught initially if I was a bit more thorough, but we did catch them eventually, but we'll get into that. And here we go. For those folks out there. That is a new mainspring. The original one I got wouldn't fit the washer, was just basically exactly the same size as the barrel. And it didn't really want to fit in. I decided to unwind it from that and put it in the winder and install it manually. All right, OCD is satisfied. We got our clicks in. Now we can move forward. Beginning assembly, we can start off with our barrel and applying some HP 1300 to the center wheel. We can put that into place gently. And now our barrel bridge. Lastly, we'll go ahead and reattach these 3 screws holding it in place. Once they're all down, we'll just give each one a snug. And now we can lubricate our upper barrel arbor port and our upper center wheel port. And we'll lubricate the bottom barrel arbor port when we lubricate the rest of the wheel train. Moving on, we can install our click. So anytime you see that red lubrication, that's going to be Mobius HP 1300. We get our spring in position. I'm just going to nudge it ever so slightly up and give me a little bit more relief for when we put in our click. And our click screw. Really pretty polish on those screw heads. Now that that's secured, we can go ahead and set tension on this spring. And again, Omega makes it very convenient to set spring tension on these with this movement design. There we go. and I'm applying just the tiniest amount of grease just to the tip of that click spring. Because whether you're winding the watch or wearing the watch, and it's constantly being wound with the automatic works, that click and click spring are always engaging with one another. So we want to have some grease at that point because it's going to be heavily used, and we'll just clean up a little bit of splash that I made. Now we can get this beautifully made part into place. You can see that square cut in that to engage with the barrel arbor. And the manual shows a few different points that we need to lubricate. So right there where the upper ratchet wheel is going to mount, and again on these teeth. And lastly on this little flat. We also want to lubricate this little gear on this ratchet wheel. Now we can install that, and just making sure that that gear is engaged. And when it is, that wheel will sit flush and we can turn that ratchet wheel around and watch that screw head rotate. And all right, we know we're in a good spot. Now we can screw down our ratchet wheel screw. And once we get it to a point where it's turning the whole assembly, we'll just use our little utility pick to hold the ratchet wheel steady and snug up that screw. Next up is our washer for the crown wheel. A little bit of lubrication here on this point. And we can get our crown wheel in place. Now we need to lubricate the inside lip of this crown wheel where it's going to rotate around the core. So some HP 1300 right there. And we can install our crown wheel core. And yes, I do see that tiny little speck of something. Get off there. And with this off-center screw, again, these are typically reverse threaded screws, but this off-center one is not. So it tightens in the standard manner to the right. And I'm just going to give this a quick, just little function test here. It looks like that ratchet wheel is engaging properly and everything's moving smoothly. So, all right. Feeling good about that. We can move forward. All right, folks. I'm going to speed up the footage here a little bit, but you'll see me fiddle with this wheel train. But while we do that, I should tell you this watch has a kind of an interesting backstory. The again, it came from a gentleman named Lee, who's out of Queensland, Australia, and he got some really interesting history with this watch. This watch was bought new in the 60s by a gentleman who worked for the Queensland State Police. He was a lead detective at the time, and this was back in 63. Later on, he was he was at that police department along with his wife Claire during there was a time, it's kind of noteworthy, there's books written about it. It's called the Rat Pack area with the Queensland State Police in the 60s and 70s, where corruption was rather rampant. And Lee was one of the good guys, and it was very difficult for him to be involved with that department during that time. But he eventually retired in the 80s. At the time, he was acting deputy commissioner for the Queensland State Police. I don't remember if it was called deputy commissioner or deputy superintendent, but really high ranking. His wife was one of the very first female employees of the state police, and retired with him as well. So this watch has definitely seen some history, which I think is pretty interesting. Lee was telling me about it, and I did some research on it. And there was books written about that time, and they interviewed Lee's wife Claire about that, although she was kind of, didn't divulge a whole lot, but it was just a very difficult time for them to be involved with during all that. And there were good people mixed up with, in that department while they were trying to weed out the bad people. So this watch was on the wrist of someone kind of going through the Queensland Police Rat Pack era. And, but he was one of the ones helping clean up that department. So really bit of interesting history with this watch. So thank you, Lee, for sharing that. But finally, we got that escape wheel pivot into place. And I'm just double checking that everything's turning freely. before we put any screws in. We got some nice kickback on that wheel train, which is good to see. All right, so now we can go ahead and get the 2 screws that secure this bridge into place. Once we get them both down and one more test to make sure we're good, I'll go ahead and snug these 2 screws back up. Moving on, we can lubricate the wheel train. So I'm using my smallest oiler here and trying to be very deliberate in the amount of lubrication that we're placing on these wheels. Using Mobius 9010 for the 3rd wheel, 4th wheel, and escape wheel on this movement. On the back side of the watch, lubricating those same pivots. A lot easier to do this now. That hour wheel makes it difficult to do that one later. And a little bit of HP 1300 for the lower barrel arbor port. Moving on, we can install our pallet fork. And as you watch me try to get this in there, the issue with this is that one of the teeth for the escape wheel is kind of interfering with the entry stone, which is that stone on the right side of the pallet fork. I need to move this escape wheel to give clearance so that pallet fork can sit down, and there we go. Now we can put our bridge into place. This is a very tight fitting bridge. So we'll kind of get it started and zoom in here, and we want to make sure that the upper and lower pivots are in place as we push this bridge plate down. So just going to move this pallet fork a little bit and make sure it's there. And we'll press that down. There we go. All right, now we're in place. We can tighten up these 2 screws holding that pallet fork bridge down. Move it on to the other side. Assembly of the keyless works begins by applying a little bit of grease to those side walls where the winding pinion is going to rub. And then more of that same heavy grease on the forward facing teeth of that winding pinion where it's going to engage with the sliding clutch. Once that's on, we can go ahead and put this into place. And that winding pinion is where the whole process begins of winding the watch. When you turn the crown, that wheel turns and that engages with the crown wheel we installed on the other side of the movement. And then through the rest of the work all the way to winding the barrel and winding the mainspring. Our sliding clutch goes into place, and applying more of that same heavier grease, that blue grease, to the side walls of that little channel where the yoke is going to ride. It's more important to lubricate the side walls than it is the base, because the yoke is going to push on the side. It really doesn't engage with the base all that much. And in that port in the main plate, we applied some grease, and we can get our setting lever in place. And some HP 1300 here on the post for the yoke. The yoke can go in, and then once it's on the post, we make sure that it's in that little recess in the sliding clutch. Next thing we want to do is install the tension spring for the setting lever. And so a little bit of grease there where it's going to be pressing down on that. And now you can see me fumble with this screw as we put it in. And normally I'd chop out a lot of that footage because it just seems irrelevant. But for whatever reason, I guess I decided to leave it in this video. So you see a lot of screw placing footage where you normally don't in my videos, because it just seemed like my videos are long enough as it is. So I've always kind of left that out just to try to save tiny amounts of time. But checking where the setting lever and yoke engage with one another, I get that mental picture, and I make sure that I apply some grease to those points. And this footage is actually sped up. I'm trying to be very slow and deliberate to try to minimize the amount of, sloppy grease work and try to just have it on the exact points we want to use. And again, I'm applying a dab of that grease on the edge of this yoke spring where it's going to engage with the yoke. So we'll get that spring down, and then I'll use my little hold down tool once I get it in place to try to keep this spring from flying off, and you'll see me fiddle with it a little bit at first. And eventually we'll pull this thing back and get it around the back side of this yoke. There we go. Pressing down the other end. All right, good to go. Next up, we can get the rest of our motion work installed. We're going to lubricate the posts here and get our setting gear installed. And then we can move on to our cannon pinion and our minute wheel. And while we're at it, ladies and gentlemen, I sure would appreciate it if you gave a quick like and subscribe to the channel. It takes 2 seconds on your part, and it really does help this channel. It reaches a wider audience and helps it grow. And I really appreciate you doing that. It really means a lot to me. YouTube analytics are kind of interesting. You can see here it says 77% of the people who watch this channel are not subscribed. So if you wouldn't mind, take those 2 seconds and subscribe to the channel. Clearly you can see, because everything on the internet is true, subscribing to this channel does prevent awkward high fives. It also, ensures good front row parking whenever you go to the store. So subscribing has its benefits. But thanks so much. I do appreciate it. We got our setting lever put down and the screws started but not fully tightened. And I'm applying some heavy grease here and really doing a bit of overkill. I think probably professional watchmakers and whatnot might either laugh or scoff at me for doing this, but I don't know. I just find that the first time you start engaging pulling the crown out and all that, if you don't have a liberal amount of grease on there, it can be quite difficult. And it makes me feel a bit uncomfortable, almost to the point where I feel like I'm going to break a spring or something. And grease in the right spot at the very beginning is very helpful. So we just clean up the excess when we're done. Here you can see a non-rusted and brand new stem along with an Omega signed gold crown. I do have the part number for the original crown. This one here is slightly different. The original part was no longer available. The Omega documentation says to use this part number in its place. It's the same diameter, but it doesn't have, the old one had a domed tip on it. This one's got a flat tip, but this is the correct replacement crown that Omega would have put in this movement if they replaced it from the factory. So yes, I'll clean up that little smudge of grease on that setting lever plunger, but we got the stem put back in. Now we can just give this thing a quick test, make sure that winding and pulling the crown in and out and all the functions are there. And that feels really good, really positive clicking inward and outward. And since we have our pallet fork in place, we can go ahead and apply some wind to this movement, and winding feels excellent. Good deal. Now we can go ahead and just clean up a little bit of excess grease. And I noticed a little spot that I made on the setting lever spring and all that, and little spots on the movement. And after everything's assembled, I do kind of off camera, but I'll go over the movement with a fine tooth comb and try to get any little specks of dust and whatnot off there. And it's really interesting to see this footage afterwards, because it provides me a different view than what I see sitting over it, because the cameras are at a different angle. So sometimes I'll see something on camera that you don't really see from your position at the bench. We apply some escape lubrication to the exit stone, and we'll apply this to 5 teeth. And I repeat this process 2 more times. And with that done, we can go ahead and install our balance wheel. This is done by getting that bottom pivot in place first, and then rotating it around so that the impulse stone enters the pallet fork from the correct orientation. And a little bit of shake to get this thing going. There we go. All right. And that honestly is the best part for me of the whole process. And I'm sure probably most people who do this say the same thing, but the favorite part from the first one I ever did, which is probably the 4th or 5th watch I ever worked on before I got a balance to swing when I put it in. But that's the best part. And then the most nerve-wracking part is the first time you put it on the time grapher, which we're going to do. And so, folks, here we go. This is where things turn sideways a little bit. And that's a matter of opinion. But that is my opinion. So all I did, this watch has been running 20 minutes or so. And generally, I like to put it on quickly just to get a base reading. These numbers aren't final. All I did was correct the beat error, set the rate a little bit. It's not regulated. But the amplitude's what I'm looking at. We got a little bit of positional difference, which we can work on that. But in my opinion, just my opinion, this amplitude is like 15 to 20 degrees lower than where I'd like to see it initially. Granted, after several days of running in, that does get better, but this seems low to me. And although right now this thing would keep solid time and we could move forward, it's enough for me to not be pleased. So if you watch the top pivot on this, we disassemble it and we're checking in shake on the wheel train. And so, folks, we're going to kind of go through the wheel train here. There's a lot of microscope footage coming up. Some of it gets a bit shaky, so I apologize for that. But in shake on the escape wheel looked all right. In shake on the fourth wheel looks okay. Going over to the third wheel, this is where we start to see something. There's not a lot there. The escape wheel should have the least amount. Fourth wheel, just slightly more, but not much. Gradually, in shake increases as you move backwards. And that third wheel had less in shake than the escape wheel. Here's our center wheel, or second wheel of the wheel train. And to me, that looks proper for that wheel. And we're super zoomed in, so it looks like a lot, but in reality, it's just a tiny amount. This is microscopic, the amount this thing has. And so that's just definitely, to me, that's just not right. It's not enough. Whether that's the cause of our low amplitude, I'm not sure at this point, but it's definitely an issue. And so that's what a lot of this stuff is going to be. So I pull the train bridge off, and you can see it's difficult to show, but that jewel is sitting a little bit proud of the bridge plate. And it doesn't necessarily, the correct position may not necessarily be flush with the bridge plate, but with it pushed down that far, that's causing our wheel to have less and less in shake. So I pressed the jewel back in flush as a starting point, and it turned out that was basically the point where I got the in shake I was looking for. Problem number two, the same bridge. This is the jewel for the escape wheel. And as you can see, it is crooked. One side's below the level of the bridge plate, one side's above, and that creates basically an angle. And so that pivot is going through the jewel, and the jewel's at a bit of an angle. So any side shake that there would be, which is usually 1 to 2 thousandths or 1 to 2 hundredths, is probably negated. So what I'm doing is I'm pressing the jewel in deeper and intentionally making it proud, as you see here, where the idea is once I have it pushed out too far, I can then use a larger stump on the jeweling tool. That's a better view of it. A larger stump on the jeweling tool and press it back down. And so the larger stump on the jeweler, or the larger pusher, should contact the bridge plate. And I'm sorry, this is really shaky footage. But once it contacts the face of the underside of the bridge plate, that jewel should be even. And that's what we're looking for. And then I'll adjust it up or down as necessary to get the desired in shake, which is really what it was to begin with also. But now that jewel is in there straight and not crooked. So we do have that 1 to 2 hundredths of in shake or side shake that we need for that part. The next problem. This is something I really should have caught beforehand. This is on me, but we're catching it now. In shake for the barrel is basically non-existent. There is just the tiniest amount, and probably not enough. And I think this is more than likely one of two issues. So I adjusted the bushing height, and I went ahead and also polished the inside of that bushing. I closed it up to get rid of all that slop we saw, and then I polished it. And now here's the end result of that. I'm liking that in shake, and that may be too much. I don't know. I'm self-taught here, but in my experience, that's a good amount. The next thing we're addressing is the barrel. This is the barrel wall of the original barrel. It is scored, and could be reused. This is not reusable, I don't think. This is the barrel lid. There's some damage to the lip. There is a heavy scoring, and so we're going to get a whole new barrel. Doing second checks again and third checks on the jewels. This has been done a few times, but there was a lot of work and a lot of inspection, a lot of disassembly and reassembly and double checking things. Here's another issue I found. This one was difficult to find. This is the capstone for the upper barrel arbor jewel. And I'll go ahead and freeze the frame when it kind of hits it. If you look dead center, you'll see a tiny little dimple in that jewel. That is created by the steel pivot for the barrel, or for the balance staff, basically wearing a dimple in that jewel. So we got a whole new cap jewel for that. Brand new Omega barrel and arbor. They came out of the cleaning machine, and as you can see here, the inside lip of the barrel wall is different. Here's the replacement. And you can see it has those kind of machine slats in it, whereas the original smooth. This is the correct barrel for this movement, and we got some braking grease reapplied. I also took this opportunity and installed yet another brand new mainspring because that new one I installed earlier I had pulled out a few times during checking, and I just thought it would be worthwhile to install a new one again, fresh. All right, folks, now we can watch this whole movement assembly all over again. Don't worry, I won't make you sit through it all. I actually am going to put the whole movement assembly in here again, but we're going to massively speed up the footage. And during the course of fault finding and error checking and all that, I took this movement apart a few times and reassembled it. So, you know, during that 2 week period of ordering parts and waiting for them to arrive and fault finding and trying to be hypercritical on my inspection and address absolutely anything I could find that didn't look right, it retaught me a lesson in inspection. And since I wasn't worried about camera placement or stopping a shot, stopping doing something to make sure something was lined up with a camera or something, you know, it taught me a valuable lesson about again, there's a balance between making good video, but also doing the watch a proper service. And my inspection originally, the assembly was good, but then the cleaning was good, but the inspection could have been improved. And so I relearned that lesson on this watch. But I've done this assembly and reassembly on this movement enough times at this point. I could do one of these Omega 550 series with one hand tied behind my back and a blindfold on. But you know, I think this footage here kind of gives a different perspective. And thankfully, I was able to keep the movement in the camera for the most part. And considering I didn't have to stop and change lighting or realign something to a camera, I think for the most part, it's all on there. But we're finishing this up, getting our escapement put into place. We'll relubricate our escapement, and now we can put in our balance. And I'll tell you, you know, it makes editing a lot easier. Just have one long camera file and just speed it up and call it a day. Okay, well, this is after everything we did. And these are the initial time graph for readings again, just having the movement running just barely long enough to, you know, 20 minutes at this point, correct the beat error, adjust the rate slightly. And you can see we got about a 20 to 30 degree bump, which is kind of what I'm looking for on this. I've seen these movements hit 270 right away. You know, I was talking with Lee, the owner of this watch, and I think this is proper. The timekeeping on this thing is going to be great. You notice our positional difference is negligible at this point, and that was done. I'm sorry because I wasn't really concerned about filming, but at the time, but that was fixed by very slight, and I mean ever so slightly, closing the regulating pins on the balance. But we got that done, and that cleaned up a lot of our positional error in timekeeping. But now with that done, we're going to go ahead and put in our sweep seconds pinion, gently putting that in place where it engages with the third wheel, and putting the tiniest dab I can possibly do, which looks huge, but we're so zoomed in on that tiny, tiny part of 9010. And now our tension spring can go on. And this is touchy. It really is. I don't think the video really does a great job of, you know, showing that, but getting the hold down tool in place and getting the screw started is touchy. But there we go. We have a brand new tension spring that doesn't have that worn out dimple, which will create less friction. And now what I'm doing, I temporarily reattached the automatic works bridge, and I'm looking at the pinion on that sweep seconds pinion where it's engaging with the third wheel. To install the seconds hand, you have to press it in, but it's going to move that sweep seconds pinion. And I wanted to see if it would separate from the third wheel before contacting the backside of the automatic plate. And it did. The plate stops it before it disconnects, which is good because the movement holder to support the rear jewel of this to install that sweep seconds pinion is $60 before shipping just to install the seconds hand. And you have to support that rear jewel. Thankfully, on this movement, the automatic works bridge, if installed, will do that. So I didn't have to buy a particular size movement holder just for this watch, which eventually, would come in handy on other watches, but I didn't have one of this size. So thankfully, we're good. Assembling this automatic works, that reversing wheel, we thoroughly cleaned and then we treated it with Lubetta V105. And technically, this model of reversing wheel can be disassembled with a specialty tool and a specialty base. And Omega has lubrication instructions using 9010 to service that. I don't have that tool. I could make one, but Lubetta V105 was basically made to service those without having to separate it, things like that, and other things. And what Lubetta V105 is basically an alcohol base with a very light and thin lubricant like 9010. And what'll happen is you soak it in there, and eventually when it pulls out and you let it dry, the alcohol evaporates and coats all the internals and everything with the tiniest film, microscopic film of 9010, basically, and does the job of properly lubricating those wheels. And it services you. This one is serviced perfectly well with it. It works great. Giving it a quick test by winding this larger idler wheel, those two side wheels, I'm going to call idler wheels, but there's a small one and a large one, and they are very specific to the position and their orientation. There's an upside and a downside. So making sure those are properly installed. The test worked. And so regardless of which way we turned that large idler wheel, which is what the arbor rotates against, or what the oscillating weight rotates against, the driving wheel still, turned in the same direction. So this is a bidirectional winding system, and it is working properly. Now we can get this bridge set into place. And before we screw it down, we need to wind the watch and get the driving wheel and the ratchet wheel to mesh together. And what it is right there, that bridge will set in place. Once that's in and turning like it should, we can go ahead and install our two screws holding this bridge plate down. And that movement looks really, really good with that bridge install. You just kind of fills in that gap and makes it look quite nice. Snugging up those two screws. Now it's time to install our replacement dial foot screw. And yes, I found the part number from Omega for that one screw. And since it says Omega on it, it's got to be expensive. That's a $14 screw, but we need it. We got the screw in, and I loosened them back out so that we can put in our dial later, but didn't remove them. But finishing the front side of this movement, we can get some HP 1300 on our cannon pinion, and now we can set in our hour wheel, making sure that it is meshed with the pinion on the minute wheel. And this watch was missing the dial washer that has a curved dial, and this needs a dial washer. So installing a new dial washer, that will keep the hour wheel held down during its operation. Now our dial goes back on nice. And although I am obstructing the view of every camera with this first dial foot screw, the second one, I realize that, and we get that tightened in. And I want to address these hands if possible. So I'm just kind of holding the hand and this little tool and using what they call it a magic eraser to try to clean up any marks that can be removed. Also giving Rodico a shot. Folks, if you want to take a look at the description of the video, and you can see a lot of the marks are underneath the coating on that, so they can't really be removed. This is super close up. So when the watch is on your wrist, you can't even tell, but clean up the hands as best we could. That's tritium lume in those hands. But if you take a look at the description of the video, tools like that magic eraser and all those little small tools, I got a lot of questions on, hey, what's that called? Where do I find it? Stuff like that. And so at the request of a Patreon supporter a while back, he was asking me about that, and he said a list would be handy. So that got me motivated, and I made a list of, 95% of all the tools that I own or that I use when I work on a watch and where I source them. And so there is a Google document. It's free to anyone. There's a link in the description of the video. You can take a look. If there is an affiliate link in there for anything Amazon related that you can source, it's an affiliate link, but don't feel obligated to use it. Just use it for research. Trust me, I don't pay a single bill from affiliate link sales. I think in my entire lifetime, I've earned just barely over $20. So trust me, I mean, it's bought me lunch for 2 days over the course of a year. So, but there is a lot of information that's compiled in there. It took me a while to put together, along with notes and all that. What I found that's good, what's not good, what I regret spending money on, what I wish I would have bought sooner. Free to anyone who just wants the information. Check out the link in the description to that document. So as you saw, we got our crystal put back into place, and we are combining our movement and case back together. Once we get it in, I'll make sure that that movement is seated down properly. Now we can rotate this around and align the movement with the crown tube so we can put our stem back into place. We got our new crown and stem. We'll go ahead and get that put back into place. It's only temporary, and we still need to trim that stem down to fit the movement, but for now, we just want to put it back into place, and I'm just going to press this plunger back down and get that in, and we'll give it a quick test just to make sure that it's seated in fully, which it looks like it is. And now we can move on and install our case clamps. So that first one goes in, and again, that feeds into the underside of a lip, and as you screw it in, it'll tighten up against that lip. This other one on the other side was our culprit earlier, and the elevation in that, it had kind of just worn flat. So I used some plastic lined pliers basically to hold that without bending it. And I just kind of ever so slightly adjusted it and made the elevation a little bit more, a little bit higher. And that basically, that steeper incline makes it grab the case tighter. So now that movement is secure in the case and not going to move around. Now we can trim our stem. And so I measured exactly 3 millimeters from the crown in the fully inward position to the edge of the case. So I'm just using a Sharpie to mark 3 millimeters on this stem. Now I'm going to go ahead and cut this just barely shy of my mark, leaving just a tiny bit left. And then I'll file that down with an Arkansas stone, adjusting as necessary to get the desired length. And once I have it where I like it, we can go ahead, and I'm using some thread locker. This blue thread locker is non-permanent, although it definitely will not come loose unless you are very intent on removing it. And if you are intent on removing it, heat will help. But once that's in, and after about 24 hours, it will cure, and that crown will not budge on that stem, will not budge. But the blue is non-permanent, red is permanent. But as it gets screwed in, a little bit of it squeezes out. So I'm just using some Rodico to clean that up. And since this is hopefully the last time we install this crown and stem, I'm going to apply just a very thin coat of the grease one last time. And now we can put this in. Once we're there, one more time, as we depress lightly on the crown, we press in the plunger for the setting lever, and hopefully that crown just pops into place. Right there. Getting towards the end of this video here, we need to install our oscillating weight, so some lubrication on the post. And that post is another common wear point, but this one here was in great shape on this movement. And yes, I do see that tiny little piece of dust or something on the rotor. I do clean it up before closing this case up fully. But getting our gib back into place, if you find that it's stubborn, you can lift up the rotor just a little bit because it needs to slide between the underside of the rotor and that pinion. Once it is in there, it'll slide into place. And then we try to get that gib flush. But as we screw it down, it'll basically pull down on the top side of that pinion underneath it, and you'll see that rotor set right into place. Perfect. A quick test just ensures that this rotor is functioning properly. It's nice and smooth, not rubbing against anything, and it's just working beautifully. Last thing I want to check is the winding. And now, unlike when we started, the winding on this watch feels beautiful. We don't have any helicopter effect, and that reversing wheel is happy, which makes me happy. We're using our little Seiko greasing pad and applying a thin layer of silicone grease to this caseback gasket. And this is not a generic gasket. This one is made specifically for this watch case, and which means it's going to fit in this little groove. It's a tight squeeze, which is what you want, but you'll see me fiddle with it. But I'll massage that gasket back and forth a little bit just to make sure it's in that groove all the way around. Now we can get our case back put on. There's a few little water spots on this case back after the drying process, after final cleaning, but that just wipes away. We'll take care of that momentarily. Making sure that the case back is properly secured. And so Lee had told me he wanted to put a really nice strap on this. And I offered a few suggestions of brands. This is one of my two favorite brands. These are made to order. I really like this brand. Again, this is not a sponsorship of anything. I'm not saying the brand. If you can read it, you can see it. But I'm just telling you that I like this brand. I've never had a strap from them that wasn't exceptionally well made. They do take a little bit to ship because they make them to order, and they can take a couple weeks before they ship out. But they make these to order and just do fantastic work. And I wish the lighting in this really did it justice, because it in the sunlight and all that strap really makes this gold watch pop. So taking a look at this after we get it all put together, you can see that tension ring in the crystal really creates that dynamic effect, and really, really pops when it's installed in the correct orientation. But I think this watch cleaned up just exceptionally well. Lee told me that he's getting married soon, which congratulations, Lee. And he said, hey, that he was thinking about, buying a watch for the wedding and all that. And then he told me, he's like, you know what, I'm going to wear this Omega to my wedding. So congratulations, Lee. This watch is stunning in person. My desk lighting does not do it justice. It's just beautiful. So folks, that is the video. A shout out to the patrons of this channel. Again, thank you for your support. Shout out to our newest members, Matt, Jeffrey, Matthew, Lenny, Evil Mr. X, very ominous, Vincent, Matthew again, that's 3 Matthews, Vince, and Andre. I appreciate y'all so much. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I really hope you enjoyed it. An awful lot of work went into it. Thank you to Lee for sending me and trusting me with your watch. It means a lot to me. And folks, I just wish you the best. Until the next video, which we're going to start on real quick, I hope you have a great one. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other, and we'll see you soon.